Hello, and welcome to another edition of the World Discord podcast. I'm Joel Ostrow.
And I'm Brian Endless. How you doing, Joel?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Just fine, thank you.
We are going to have a conversation today about the general subject of international crimes, in particularly as they relate to organized conflict. So we will be discussing in broad terms the institutional aspects, namely the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and then various categories of crimes that those courts hear or potentially could hear, maybe the better way of putting it, namely war crimes under the broad heading of the Geneva Conventions and crimes against humanity. Um, so maybe I will, Brian, instead of my giving a background, could you offer us a little historical background of both the concepts of international crimes, maybe, and of those institutions?
Yeah, happy to, Joel. I don't want to spend too much time on the ancient history. Laws of war go
Yeah.
back 3,000 years, so it goes back quite a while. The basic concept of it, but when we got into the late 1800s, early 1900s, states were starting to realize that combat should have some law behind it, and there were agreements on what that law should be. They were usually agreements to protect states and protect soldiers, and then protect civilians as we move further along. So the Permanent Court of Justice began after World War One, and that was moved into what now exists. The International Court of Justice is part of the UN Charter and started after World War Two. The ICJ is a state organization. It's one of the six main branches of the UN. The ICJ has nothing to do with individual charges. The ICJ just focuses on disputes between states. So state A and state B can come together and say, you know what, we've been fighting for 20 years over this border. We want to take this to the court and let the ICJ decide what's going to happen. And there have been about 175 of those cases since 1948, so they're not that common. The other thing the ICJ can do is it can give advisory decisions. And that's one that came up very recently, for instance, with the case of Israel in Gaza. The ICJ was asked to do an advisory decision on whether they thought Israeli actions might fall under the category of genocide. And they gave an advisory opinion on that. So there are a couple different ways the ICJ can act. It doesn't have any force of law, but the UN, through the Security Council, can provide that force. And frankly, most of the time, the ICJ doesn't need force of law, because most of the time it's two countries coming together and saying, hey, resolve this dispute for us. We're going to live by it, whatever you do. ICC, an International Criminal Court, on the other hand, is relatively new. It was originally approved in 1998 and didn't go into force until 2002. Up until that time in human history, there had been almost no prosecution, excuse me. There's been almost no prosecution of.
Lots of persecution.
Exactly. No, persecution comes first, and then you
Yeah,
prosecute
yeah,
the
yeah,
persecutor. So,
yeah.
so that's good. There have been almost no prosecution of individuals who were accused of committing the worst crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, mass deportation, those types of things. There just wasn't any body to do it. The world looked at this as state activities. You punish the state. It wasn't until after World War II that we had the first criminal tribunals. They were the ad hoc tribunals for Nuremberg and Tokyo, the tribunals for Nazi and Japanese genocidaires and war criminals. And those were something that was new. The people who put those tribunals together, the Allies, created new law when they put those together. We saw tribunals a few other times since that. The two biggest ones that the United Nations approved were the tribunals in 93 and 94 for the former Yugoslavia, and then for Rwanda. And again, for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanities, and other high crimes that were committed in those areas. And that was kind of a turning point. That post Cold War world
Yeah.
was a turning point where countries got together and said, you know what, it's a good idea to have a standing court as
Yeah.
opposed to a bunch of ad hoc courts. We should have some law that applies, that the worst of the worst know if they do something, they can be brought before a court afterwards for their crimes. So it's not just
Regular rules of procedure,
yeah,
regular processes, regular and sort of universal understanding of what could land you there as opposed to ad hoc is
exactly. Yeah,
always
more
better.
a more regular
Yeah.
process of justice is what they were looking at.
And can I ask you, so it's interesting because even as you laid that out, your description blends together war crimes and crimes against humanity. Um, War crimes as a phrase, I think we can understand, and people think that we've heard of the Geneva Conventions, they've been around for a while, and people sort of think they know what that means when they've heard about militaries that have committed atrocities. Most famously in the United States would be the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, which would definitely fall under the heading of war crimes, crimes committed by soldiers on the battlefield.
Right.
Can you distinguish crimes against humanity? That it is murkier because it's murkier, and that makes it murkier for most people. Can you clear away some of the murk?
It is easy in one way and undefined in others.
Yeah,
So the easiest way, and I'll use this one just at a very basic level, talking to students about it as an example. War crimes or crimes against humanity are war crimes without the war.
yeah,
If there's
okay,
not a war going on and you commit something that falls under Geneva Convention or other war crimes, you probably committed a crime against humanity. There was no solid definition of that. There was just precedent on that until the ICC Charter in 1998. And
yeah,
at that time, the ICC Charter formalized that those crimes committed outside of times of war should be counted as crimes against humanity. And the ICC lists a number of those. But even in those cases, it's always crime A, crime B, crime C, and the
yeah,
like.
yeah, right,
So it is, we can't define this, frankly, because human beings are too evil and too creative sometimes.
it's like
And,
pornography. You know a crime against humanity when you see it.
yeah,
Uh,
thank you,
but
thank you, Potter Stewart.
but it is in some ways uh, at least in the popular understanding, a false distinction because people are talking about crimes against humanity as Russia's committing against uh, in Ukraine or as Israel is carrying out in Gaza. Why is it just ignorance that leads to the use of that phrase, or are there crimes against humanity that are not war crimes happening
Yeah,
there?
there are both. So let's take Ukraine and Russia as an example. If you take an area in eastern Ukraine that Russia has already captured and pacified, and you have civilians in that area, and the children of those civilians are taken away to be brought to Russia and re educated, that is a crime against humanity.
Although your use of the word pacified is rather subjective. That's the
Absolutely.
problem.
100%.
Because Ukrainians would say the war started in about 2013 and has not
100%.
stopped. Yeah.
But if it is behind lines, if it is
Uh,
not as a part of an active conflict,
oh, active combat.
it technically moves into the crimes against humanity category. So
But the
once you
seizing of the kids in Bucha at the start of this
that
war,
that
those are
would be a
war
war
crimes.
crime.
But the
Exactly.
same thing can happen, right? The
Exact same
human,
thing.
right?
And if that exact same thing happens and you are not in an area with an active war going on, then that can be a crime against humanity. Now, all three of these, here's the part that people really don't understand, and it's almost impossible to explain.
Yeah.
All three of these have similar penalties. It's
Wait, what's
not
the
as
third?
if the third being genocide. I'm sorry.
Oh,
It's not as if the penalties are enormously worse. So, as an
right.
example, you can commit war crimes and kill 100,000 people, and commit genocide and only kill 1,000 people. The committing of 100,000 people is a worse crime,
Yeah.
but it was probably not done if it's a war crime. The distinction there is genocide includes an intent to wipe people out, and we can talk more about that. So if you just bomb cities and kill 100,000 people, 100,000 civilians, that may be a war crime that has no genocide involved in
Right.
it at all as a part of war.
Right.
So the fire bombings of Tokyo and Dresden, as an example, I would argue should be considered early examples of war crimes.
And I want to go back to something that you said you didn't want to talk about, but I think it's really important. All of this exists, these crimes that are defined, and let's not talk about. I want to have an in-depth conversation on the value of having these crimes on the books when they keep happening, but that's a separate discussion. I think it's important to talk a little bit about where these concepts came from, because although it's relatively new for uh, human civilization over the last maybe couple hundred years that these things have been codified as law, there's nothing new about them. Homer set down the story of Achilles in the Iliad onto paper around, what was it, 450 BC, I
Yeah,
believe. And those were events that took place, if they took place at all, long, long, long before that, and were told as oral tradition. And really, that oral tradition turned those stories into myth. But those myths at the time served as sort of like the Bible for how to and how
right,
not to conduct conflict. The Iliad is at the same time it's a story about post-traumatic stress disorder of Achilles. We don't need to go into that, but it chronicles basically every kind of war crime that armies can commit against
right,
other soldiers, against other. So it is a long tale of violations of the rules of war, which
right.
existed all the way back then. And people, if anything, I would, as you were sort of laying it out, I was thinking, I wonder if these have been codified to paper over the last many decades because armies have stopped following them to the extent that they had for millennia. And I don't know if that's fair. Maybe it's not true. Um, but I get a
I
sense
don't.
that soldiers followed a lot of these, like don't allowing the collection of bodies in no man's land, stopping the fighting for whether it was holidays or at nighttime or weather.
Right.
Like there were all these kinds of rules that
So
they followed.
these were traditions, and like many laws, let's get into international law definitions here. There
Yeah.
have been customary laws of war since there was war.
Right.
And there have been customs that people in different areas of the world followed. I don't know that we can say there were any international customs until the Napoleonic Wars, basically. Although actually it's probably before.
Well, they're all international. They weren't global customs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But global until the British Empire certainly was probably some of the earliest global customs of war. The British expecting the Americans to wear blue because they were wearing red,
Right.
and expecting the Americans to not hide behind rocks and behind buildings and shoot at them.
Right.
We violated customs of war. We were considered, evil terrorists and renegades and rebel scum when we did it, because there were customs of war that we
Right.
violated because we didn't want to die and we wanted to win.
Right.
So that's certainly out there. The violation of laws of war and now, and of customs of war in the past, was generally looked down upon by those who consider themselves quote unquote civilized nations.
Yeah.
And that definition has no definition. That term has no definition.
Yeah.
And it is variable from time to time, and it tends to mean the powerful. The powerful tend to create these. That doesn't mean that they don't help others, but what often happens is the powerful create rules that are biased toward them, as the British did toward the Americans, and expect the weaker power to follow them. And then you have guerrilla war when the weaker power doesn't follow them. And that's usually the other side of it. When you look at modern warfare, though, I think it basically runs into two categories in terms of customs and laws of war. The first is, mentioned these earlier, protecting civilians. The
Yeah.
second is protecting protecting soldiers.
Hmm.
There has been in modern times only, you go back 500 years, and there were no caveats on protecting civilians.
Right.
Killing civilians for thousands of years was just a part of
It was
war.
unknown.
Uh,
Yeah.
what we now call genocide, wiping
Yeah.
people out, was a part of war for thousands of years. But then, as we move forward and maybe became more civilized, again, using that word, we came to realize, and by the late 1700s, early 1800s, armies stopped rampantly killing civilians. So by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon or when his opponents were going into a town or going into a city, they would warn the city as they were pulling the cannons up. And they would send somebody with a white flag to give a
Yeah.
warning. And the warning would be civilians have 24, 48 hours to get
Get
out
out.
of the city. You can go this route. Anybody who's still here is going to be considered a combatant and fair game after
I
that.
think Genghis Khan did that.
Yes, 100%. That was a custom for a long time.
Yeah.
Everybody did not follow it. Genghis Khan was one of the first, actually, to respect the idea that he wanted civilians there afterwards.
Right.
That it was one of
Right.
these things where, yeah, I want the people to live. To
Well,
live.
let's not. Genghis Khan was also one of the most murderous
100%.
leaders in human history.
Oh
Like
yeah.
one of the most
Oh yeah. It
deadly
took
of all
enormous.
tyrants in human history. So there's a
The,
little bit of a
the guy
paradox
had
there.
one decent quality.
Yeah, yeah. Which he violated routinely, but
100%.
still, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that, and he invented polo using his opponent's head.
Correct. Yeah.
That's another one of those good things.
Yes.
But let's take soldiers as an example for these two categories. Soldiers have a vested interest in living.
Right.
Soldiers have a vested interest in not being harmed.
Not being
And the
tortured.
modern laws of war are built on customs. And
Yeah.
just an easy central custom is when somebody has a gun and they're shooting at you, they are fair game.
Right.
When someone surrenders, they are not fair game. When someone surrenders, they move into the category of prisoner of war. Now, the surrendering person has responsibilities. They need to throw down their weapons. They need to follow instructions. They can't take any violent actions,
Right.
or the other side can just summarily kill them, arbitrarily kill them. The other side, and there are some weird little caveats because the laws of war are pretty ingenious in the way they approach things. If I capture you behind enemy lines and I don't think I can safely bring you back to my side, I can shoot you, even if you surrendered,
Right.
because I get to keep myself safe.
Right.
So it's intended to keep the person you surrender to safe. You're not allowed to trick them.
Right.
But then if I capture you and get you behind lines, I need to keep you in a good and safe condition. According to the Geneva Conventions, I need to feed you and house you, shelter you as my soldiers would be fed and housed at a minimum if they were behind the lines. I need to
And
give you
that's the key. That's why this exists, because we want our
100%.
soldiers captured not to be mistreated, right?
Exactly.
And
Yeah,
the rise of the nation state really is what allowed for this sort of global understanding to emerge. Because prior to
100%.
that, things were less organized globally.
One of the things with the
Pardon.
rise of the nation state is it was also the rise of permanent militaries.
Right.
Before that point in time, you had feudal militaries where
Or
feudal
mercenary
lords,
armies. Yeah.
yeah, mercenary armies, and nobody cared about that at
Right.
that point in time.
Right.
But the permanent militaries, after a couple hundred years, led to the fact that, hey, we want to be treated well,
Right.
and the permanent militaries on opposite sides have more in common than anyone else.
Right.
And the leaders came to realize this and made these laws for protection.
Right.
And most people consider that to be a good thing. Oh, and you have to give soldiers back to their side at the end of the war.
Right.
That's the other side of it. This was a place, by the way, where World War II and the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals went way off base from the
Yeah.
laws of war because a lot of the Nazi leaders and Japanese leaders said, okay, you've taken us, we're prisoners of war. Now the war's over, give us back.
Yeah.
That's what should have been done in that situation. And we had to create new
New
rules
rules.
to
Yeah.
deal with that.
Yeah.
And then on the civilian side, the idea is wars are supposed to be between soldiers, not civilians. And again, 1800s, 1900s, up through World War One. In World War One, when one side or another advanced on a town, they gave warning that they told people that they could get out. It wasn't until World War Two that we came up with the idea, we being the big powers, came up with the idea of collateral damage. And I
Strategic bombing is
exactly, I
the
strongly
original
suggest
euphemism.
that's the
We
only
didn't call it
reason
collateral
collateral
damage
damage
then. It was
exists.
strategic bombing, right? Yeah.
And it meant that we could use our technology to bomb behind enemy lines, and we knew damn well we were going to be killing civilians.
Yeah.
And we changed definitions to say, well, if it's a legitimate target, it doesn't
Mhm.
matter if civilians are in the way.
Yeah, and then,
Right,
then the Germans bombing of London.
exactly.
Generally, history says that that kind of opened the floodgates to that in the
Absolutely.
Second World War.
And I argue pretty strongly that from a laws of war perspective, the laws are better than the practice right now because, if
Yeah,
you kill somebody's grandma or child or brother or sister or spouse, you still kill them afterwards. And
yeah.
it doesn't matter if you call them collateral damage, that person's still dead.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get to that. So, nice segue. These laws exist. Let me just relay an anecdote. I'm kind of curious about your response, and you may have seen it. Um, uh, so, as we're recording this episode, um, last week in the Israel Gaza conflict, Israel fired missiles at a school uh, and resulted in the deaths of, by Gaza's reports, roughly 90 people killed and more than a couple hundred badly injured. Um, and we don't need to go into the back and forth between what reports out of Gaza are saying and what the Israeli government is saying, because really you can't trust either. But it is clear that a school was intentionally targeted, and it is clear that there were non combatants there, and it is clear that those non combatants were killed by those attacks, or we can put it in active voice Israel killed those non combatants with their attacks. And it is
Israeli military,
clear
by the way, let's be clear. Yeah,
and it is clear that the Israeli military, that Israel, the commanders who gave the orders to fire those missiles, knew there were civilians there
right.
who they were going to kill with those attacks. All of that, I think, is non-controversial. Um, and so, I, because it had been a while um, since I had done so regarding either of these wars, I shared on social media an article about this and condemned it as a heinous attack on civilians, that schools are not legitimate targets, civilians are not legitimate targets, the kind of thing that you and I have both done pretty regularly throughout these two wars. Um, and a troll commented, I think I can safely label him a troll at this point, um, to the effect that this is war in the modern era. Uh, we firebombed Dresden and we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Germany bombed London and other cities. And war now, like there's no such thing as an illegitimate target. When war starts, civilians get killed, and um, the goal is to win, and you kill as many as people as possible. And I replied with mention of war crimes and crimes against humanity and the ICJ and ICC. And he sort of responded with the same line of argument. And I ended that conversation.
I love this argument, by the way.
I ended the conversation with the following. I said, by that illogic, let me ask you, how many people have you raped? How many people have you killed? How many
Right.
liquor stores have you knocked off and stolen from? How many banks have you robbed? These laws are on the books because we have. Well, let me get your response. Like,
Sure,
is
no
that a
problem.
reasonable reply? How many
Yeah,
people?
your troll is Not only absolutely wrong, your troll is demonstrably wrong,
He
and
isn't only merely wrong, he's really most sincerely wrong, to borrow
no,
from the wicked
we
wit.
can demonstrate exactly how your troll is wrong,
Yeah,
and the U.S. and Israeli governments regularly demonstrate it for us.
yeah,
And this is something there are a bunch of people who will say, and this is I teach international law. There is an entire stream of political thinkers and leaders who will say international law doesn't exist.
right.
And there is an easy proof that
In this
international
country, we
law
call them
does.
the Heritage Foundation.
Well, yeah, but actually,
Yeah,
realpolitik
yeah,
argues
yeah,
international law doesn't exist. It goes way beyond the Heritage Foundation.
yeah, 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 for
It
sure.
is it is everything from Eisenhower to Reagan to some extent,
Yep,
and then further. And at some point, that went away. Here's the deal: Israel doesn't say we don't have to follow these laws.
right.
Israel says
We are following the laws.
Hamas, exactly.
Yeah,
Hamas has used human shields.
yeah.
We have warned people, Israel regularly warns people to leave that area. They're following that ancient rule. That Israel, in a strange way, they may still be committing crimes afterwards, but they do follow that rule.
Well, they
And,
did in that attack on the school.
Actually, I think in some cases, even on the school, they'd said, don't be in that area, whether the school or not. But
Yeah.
Israel, when they go after individual terrorists before the October attacks, Israel would warn an apartment building that you got to get out
Hmm.
because you're about to be attacked. We think there's a
Yeah.
terrorist there. But in this case, Israel says flat out, there are human shields. Hamas may not have human shields. That is a war crime. It is, by the way. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Keeping a civilian in front of you as a human shield is a war crime, and thus we may attack.
Yeah.
The thus we may attack is
It's a
false.
war crime.
Exactly.
Right.
Everything else up to that,
Yeah.
though, is using international law. There aren't people that twirl their mustachios and say, ha ha ha, I don't have to follow international law
Right.
anymore.
Right.
We say international law is on our side. The George W. Bush administration didn't say, we're going to torture people. They said, we're going to redefine torture. And we're going to say it's only torture if it is pain equivalent to loss of a limb or an eye. Anything less than that isn't torture.
So let me
So
ask you this. Is Israel's behavior in that situation the equivalent of my troll friend? Had the troll raped someone and then said, well, I did it because I thought it would feel good?
well, it's not because I thought it would feel good. If the troll friend, and I don't love the analogy you use there,
I
you
was
could
sick
have
of
gone
them.
someplace
I
else.
was sick
But
of them.
if the I did it because I'm going to use an old horrific saying in the United States that
Yeah, yeah.
still exists in some places. I did it because she was asking for it.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yes.
I did it because
Okay.
I thought it was legal,
Not because
and,
it would feel good, but because she was asking for
and because I
it.
had a right to do it.
Okay.
And that's horrible.
Yeah.
That is absolutely
Yeah.
horrific. And killing civilians by saying that they're being used as human shields is also horrific. It's still a bad analogy, but when you look at it, I've used the human shield analogy on our show in the past, I think, and in many other
Yeah.
places. You've got a bunch of people being used as human shields. That means that a bad person who's killing people, maybe launching missiles or taking pot shots or whatever the case might be, keeps a bunch of civilians around them to make sure the other side doesn't attack them.
It's
Now,
essentially
Hamas, by the way,
kidnapping.
right, Hamas, by the way, no, it is kidnapping,
Yeah.
100%. Hamas, by the way, knows full well that Israel is going to attack anyway, and we know that Hamas doesn't care if civilians are
They
killed,
almost want
and
to.
that's arguably another war crime that
Right.
they put
Right.
civilians in harm's way and don't care that they're going to be killed. There are things galore on both sides here,
Yeah.
but even when that happens, it doesn't give Israel the right to kill those
Right.
civilians. My analogy is, think about it as a school shooting. Let's say somebody's been bombing school after school, and the FBI and the cops finally track them down, and they track them to this one school, and the guy's in a classroom with a bunch of little kids
Yeah.
and teachers, and says, "If you get me, I'll kill all these people." Well, sending a squad in to kill that guy is legal. Having a sniper take a shot is legal. Is sending in a missile that takes out half the school building and
That's
all the kids in
not
the
legal.
school illegal? Exactly.
Right.
And that's exactly what Israel is doing in that
Yeah.
case.
So, okay, there are and to give the troll his due, it is the case that in every modern war, it's hard to think of a modern war, anything since the beginning of the 20th century,
Right.
where there weren't um, there wasn't targeting of civilians on a
Right.
large scale. Um, so we have these laws of war, and states violate them, armies violate them routinely. Um, does what do you say to the people who would say so the law doesn't really exist? It's meaningless.
Yeah, it does exist. It exists around the edges. It is not a perfect law. And frankly, that's because it's a law that is enforced by power. And you can't enforce a law of war outside of power. But there are countries that follow the laws of war.
Right.
There are places that follow the laws of war. One of my favorite
Most,
examples.
most, I would
Absolutely.
argue.
No,
Yeah.
most follow the laws of war. Not perfectly, by the way, but
Yeah.
most follow it. My favorite example is the U.S. taking Japanese prisoners during World War II.
Yeah.
If you've seen Bridge over the River Kwai or
Yeah.
anything else, when the Japanese took prisoners, they treated them as slaves.
Yeah.
That was Japanese culture.
Yeah.
They were, if you surrender, if you are captured, you are less than human.
Right.
And Japanese soldiers expected when they were captured that they would be treated as less than
Same.
human, that they'd be worked to death. And damn, were they surprised when the
Right.
U.S. set up prisoner of war camps, and many of these Japanese prisoners had a roof over their head and 3 meals a
We're
day.
better fed and medicated than they were in the
100%.
Japanese army. Yep.
Exactly. That is how these things can work well. That is where they can be a positive and they can show that both sides respect each other. In World War II, also, the West, the US especially, and the Nazis had general respect for each other in prisoner of war camps. Not true between the Nazis and the Russians. And the
Right.
Nazis and the Russians, because of this,
Yep.
fought to the death
Yep.
on the Russian front because they knew that to be captured was a worse fate than death.
Yep.
Whereas on the other side, soldiers were willing to surrender in bad situations because they had a reasonable expectation of getting reasonable treatment.
Yeah.
That can work very well for both sides. It's not something where it makes sense to always break these laws of war. And then the other thing is you take, for instance, the U.S. against ISIS during the invasion of Iraq. That was a case where ISIS was acting in inhuman ways.
Right.
They were barbarians beyond the pale. I'm not going to say shooting at another military is barbarian. I am going to say beheading prisoners is
Yes.
barbarian. I think that's an easy judgment. Does that mean we should behead prisoners?
No.
Do we want to be the same kind of barbarians, or do we actually want the high moral ground, which is worth something? At the very least, it has PR value to other people in the region and to our own people, frankly, when we take the high moral ground. It
I,
can make sense to treat people as human beings.
yeah, I don't know that I would go to high moral ground, or at least the way I see it is a little different. It's they provide expectations and norms, and we expect civilians will not be targeted, even when we know that civilians are often targeted.
Right.
So it defies expectations, and so I guess the moral ground, like that's a wrong. It gives us the ability um, to acknowledge that in our grotesquely imperfect world, states are still going to go to war at times, and now states and non-state actors will go to war at times, and um, it provides us with expectations to evaluate conduct during those times,
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you an
and that's
example.
important. Otherwise,
100%. Yeah,
yeah,
let me give you an example on the U.S. side, because we always hear about Israel and Russia, and I want to bring it home to us. Our use of drones, and I'm going to
yeah,
go Democrat here, particularly during the Obama
yep,
administration.
yep,
Most of the world thinks that our use of drones constitutes crimes against humanity or war crimes, depending on
constituted
whether constituted, yes,
was
depending
a
on
better
whether
term,
there was, yeah, somewhat better.
more accurate.
Well, no, not necessarily more accurate. We do it less now. The U.S. government has always claimed we don't kill civilians, or we
Yes,
kill an absolute minimum number of civilians. There are ways,
we never tried to.
right? which is
Designated.
regardless, it doesn't matter. There are way too
Well, intent matters by another topic that we very much care about.
well, hang on though. Intent matters, but if we kill civilians and we could have known about it or
That,
should have known about
right,
it, we don't have
right,
to actively say we're trying to kill civilians. We
right.
always say we're trying to kill the terrorist. We're trying
Yeah.
to kill the bad guy. If the
If we
bad guy's
acknowledge,
uncle and wife and kids are in the
there,
car with him or in the compound with him, they are civilian casualties.
knowledge of yeah, right. Advanced knowledge of those consequences to
Exactly.
civilians is
And much of the Western world, much of Europe wants to outlaw drones in those situations
yeah.
off the battlefield because of these types of things, because they are not as discriminate as the US government likes to say they are. But
But it
drones
is
are getting
legitimate
more and more
that
popular.
intent matters. Like accidents do happen. Uh, I think it is fair to label as unfair or even extremist or on the extreme end of argument when the United States took action against Serbia to try to prevent the broader genocide from happening in Kosovo. There was a missile strike that was intended for, I believe it was a military installation, an armaments facility, I
Right.
think. And it was next to, I believe it was a hospital. And the
Yeah.
missile, they missed, it was accidental. The missile hit the hospital instead of the legitimate military target. I don't think anyone has any standing to say that we intentionally hit that hospital.
Now, and that absolutely occasionally mistakes like that happen, and they're a different category. And that's a sad reality. Way too often, when we say there are no mistakes, there are problems. And
Yeah,
especially with drones and the way the drones are used, the people who use drones, one of the problems the US has is we often don't have soldiers using drones, we have contractors doing it, and the contractors don't legally have to follow the laws of war. And there are all sorts of problems that come up in this in a very complex topic, but it is just one of those places. I mentioned torture. Torture after 9/11 was another significant problem. And we have something 13, 14 detainees in Guantanamo now. And the question was, were they going to
right.
accept a life sentence or were they going
Yeah,
to
yeah,
go in
yeah.
for that sentence? The reason we don't want to try them is they were all tortured. And under United States law, you can't try someone if their
Right.
confession came from torture.
Right, right.
It's
We have no
illegal.
way to try them really in any
Exactly.
legitimate
Yeah.
way.
You
Right,
can't call them prisoners of war because then we have to send them back,
right,
and we don't want
right,
to do that.
right,
So
right. Or
it's a
enemy
weird,
combatants, which is a thing we made up, just like
right.
other
Not
phrases
say
we've made
prisoners of war. Yeah.
up. Right, yeah. Collateral damage and hell, ethnic cleansing is a made up term.
Yeah.
Um, Let me go back though to my analogy with my troll. So we have laws, we have courts, and we have rape and murder. There's a lot of rape that happens, there's a lot of murder that happens. It doesn't get punished. But we do have courts and we do have prosecuting attorneys who do prosecute those crimes when police apprehend those who've committed those crimes, and we punish those crimes according to known legitimate procedures. There is an international criminal court, there are laws, there are these crimes regularly committed, crimes against humanity and war crimes. There's precious little use of those institutions to punish those who've committed those crimes. Uh, does that not render the whole setup a farce?
Um. Yes and no. How about that
Well,
for
that's a wimpy question. Just like a ivory tower, academic.
academic? Yeah. I was an early critic of the International Criminal Court. I have come to accept it a little bit more, but I still have some criticisms uh, toward it. And actually, a friend of mine who's now deceased, Sharif Bassioni, in Chicago, was one of the intellectual founders of the
Yeah,
International Criminal Court. A lot of the ideas were his. He was down at DePaul or Kent, I can't remember which at the
I
time.
think
But
Kent.
Yeah, it was Ken. But I chatted with Sharif about this a little bit. It's an idealistic organization
Yeah,
that has some practical uses. The idealistic side to me is that this is really not going to stop anyone, in my opinion. And there are different opinions on that. I don't think any world leader says, oh no, I'm going to go before the International Criminal Court and that's going to be terrible and I can't do that. I also don't think that most murderers say, "Oh
I
no,
was
I'm going to
kind of
get
winding
caught,
up for
and I'm
that.
going to have to go before a U.S. court, and I'm going to get punished." So I think
Hopefully, it
that's
reduces the number of murders and rapists. The idea is it would reduce the number of
what
potential war
exactly,
criminals.
and it does not. Now that being said, we just had a podcast on Sudan that was about a week ago,
Yep.
and there was some talk of the fact that people and leaders are a little careful. They don't, if they think that there's a chance they might lose at some point in time, they don't want to do things that's going to have them brought before the ICC. That is a minor factor that is out there. I do think, though, that there is something to be said for the idea of punishing the worst of the worst after the fact. And we need to realize again, these laws don't deter murder and rape no more than they deter war crimes and
They don't bring
genocide.
back the dead.
Exactly. But you take, Omar Bashir in Sudan, who's probably the highest ranking person brought before the International Criminal Court. We have a number of people out of Democratic Republic of Congo who are warlords who killed thousands and tens of thousands.
Milosevic was.
That Milosevic was brought. No,
He
no,
was
Milosevic was
president.
brought before the Yugoslavia court, not the
Yeah.
International
Oh,
Criminal Court.
he was held in The Hague, though.
Right. The Yugoslavia court was also in The Hague
Yeah. Yeah,
at the
that's right.
time.
So that was,
Um, but, those are due punishments. And that's really what the most violent end of our criminal system is about. It doesn't stop people from doing things. It does provide some semblance of justice, far from perfect justice, but some semblance of justice when the worst of the worst are eventually brought to account. And one of the things the ICC doesn't have that domestic courts do have is there's an enforcement mechanism, but no force behind it. So the ICC, in a technical sense, every state is supposed to carry out the ICC's warrants if the ICC puts out an arrest
right.
warrant against someone. But the ICC has no police or military of their own. So they have to
But
count on
Interpol
the members to do it.
could.
Interpol can technically do it on behalf of a state,
Right.
is the way that works, because Interpol also has state members.
But I would argue it does matter also. For example, Vladimir Putin is never going to be able to sail on his yacht. He is never going to be able to visit any of the many palaces that he or his, either he directly owns or are his under other people's
Be,
names,
be
whether they're
careful
in
on
France or
be
Switzerland.
careful on never. I never say never on
Well,
these.
yeah,
It
okay,
really depends on if and how Putin leaves office. So I'll give you two examples of this. One is Bashir. The minute the ICC indictment came out against Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, he planned a trip of
yes,
half the countries in Africa. He
yeah,
planned a continental trip across Africa. And what he did was, before he traveled, his foreign secretary called or wrote to the foreign
right.
secretaries of the countries and received a letter saying President Bashir and his retinue will not be held under any charges and have safe passage through the country. This was actually also done, the earliest example I know, I'm sure there was something before that, by Henry Kissinger. When
But
he was Secretary of State and when he was NSC, Henry Kissinger was under indictment for war crimes in like 35 or 40 countries that he technically couldn't travel to, including half of Europe. And in those countries, if he wanted to travel there, he'd simply get permission and a letter saying he would not be arrested. So international law,
yeah,
unfortunately, allows some ways around that.
yeah, but there wasn't an ICC back then, and Putin doesn't have his properties in the places where Bashir was traveling. He wants to go to
That is
France,
true.
Switzerland. I think it's going to be a lot more
Yeah,
difficult for him to go to those places
he won't be going to
where
those.
he won't be.
Yeah,
And I don't know about Netanyahu's holdings, but I would imagine
yeah. I
he,
don't know. I don't know that he has holdings. I'm not sure.
yeah, yeah,
He's in enough trouble in Israel if he ever leaves
yeah,
office.
yeah. It's a different situation.
Yeah.
Um, anything else that you would discuss on this topic? Like, what do you see as do you see improvement in these institutions, operations, in holding people accountable going forward? Like what would need to happen to not to reduce the incidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity? Again, it's like any other crime. It isn't, but on the surface, what would need to happen to have more people held accountable?
I'm going to give the exact same answer I've been giving my entire professional and academic career about the United Nations. What
Yeah.
would have to happen is the powerful countries of the world would have to decide that this is a useful thing.
Yep.
So, the United States, France, the UK, Russia and China to some extent, Germany and Japan, the leaders of different continents would have to come together and they would have to be willing to use international law as a mechanism. I will say I'm really happy that the ICC and ICJ have been used with Israel,
Yes.
Hamas, and with Russia. That
Yes.
is significant because
It's
before that,
new.
one of the legitimate complaints about the ICC was it was only used against African leaders,
Right.
and
Right.
honestly, that sucked.
Right.
That was bad. That
Right.
was biased.
Yeah.
But the fact that it is expanding now to the big countries in the world and to countries aligned with the West suggests that at least some, mostly middle countries, not the most powerful countries, are taking it more seriously. And they are seeing it not just as an idealistic thing, but as a lever of political power and justice. And for me, by the way, my international law perspective is there's no difference between law and power. They're the
Yeah.
same thing. The powerful make laws, the powerful implement laws,
Yep.
the powerful enforce laws. The ICC and ICJ are nothing without the powerful countries of the
Right.
world. They have no independent status. We can't blame the ICC and ICJ. We need to blame the countries that are behind them, and especially in the case of the ICC, the very large countries in the world that refuse to join them. So
Right.
most of the big powers
Including
haven't
ours.
joined the ICC. Yeah,
Including ours. Yeah. But I agree with you. I do believe the indictments against Putin and a couple of ministers under him, and Netanyahu, and the same a couple of ministers under him,
and
are
Hamas.
significant in that way, as was the case brought by South Africa and others to the ICJ against Israel. I think it, although most of the protesters in any conflict very rarely know really what they're protesting for or against, but they do know what genocide is, and they do know that there were legitimate charges brought, and that ought to be enough to say they got to stop whatever it is they're doing. They need to stop it.
Right, 100%.
Um,
Yeah,
and-
and in the case of South Africa, let's be clear on that one. South Africa brought it before the court, before the ICJ, to ask whether Israel was committing
right,
genocide.
right,
And if the ICJ says yes, they did not. They said something that was a halfway answer, and
yes,
the case is still under advisement. If the ICJ says yes, that activates the part of the Genocide Convention
right.
that says members of this
Obligation.
convention are obligated to act.
It doesn't mean they're going to act,
No, no, it does mean that they'll probably act in some way.
but
Acting, by the way, can start with "That's very, very
yeah, yeah,
bad.
yeah.
You're a
Stop it,
bad
please. We've
country."
already done that.
Right,
Yeah,
and we'll say
yeah,
we acted.
yeah, 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 yeah. But won't stop it.
No.
Yeah. Well, thanks. This is
Yeah, thank
a
you.
useful discussion. People talk about these terms all the time, and we know that these courts exist, and we know that the behavior that this whole regime of international law around conflict, it has not stopped the things that it's intended to stop. But awareness is a first step, and there's a growing universal awareness, I think, uh, that that there are things that are wrong, that shouldn't happen, even though they continue to happen. And that's the first step towards reducing the incidents.
Yeah, and if these organizations help with that awareness, then they're starting to do a good job.
Exactly.
So,
All
great.
right.
Thank you. Great discussion.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.
See you
Thank
next
you,
time.
Andy Miles, our producer, and please like and follow and share this episode, and suggest other conflicts or other topics you'd like for us to cover in the future. Until next time.
See you soon.